Hello everyone and welcome back to Royalty Now, where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Diane de Poitiers was the official mistress and advisor to King Henry II of France. Her life was marked by a passionate affair with Henry and a bitter rivalry with his wife, Catherine de Medici. Depending on the lens you take, Diane was either the great love of King Henry II's life or a manipulative woman who used her knowledge of the world to seduce a boy of just 15. Today, we'll talk about Diane's history and then discuss her image and portraits before revealing recreations of her appearance at the end. So let's go ahead and get started. Diane de Poitiers was born on January 9, 1500, in the town of Saint-Vallier, France, to Jean de Poitiers and Jeanne de Baternay. Her father, an avid sportsman, named her after the Roman goddess of the hunt, Diana. But Diane herself preferred to say that she was named after the goddess of the night and of the moon. According to family legend, an old woman who came to visit Diane as a baby made a prophecy that her star would one day rise higher than a queen's. Throughout her childhood, her family would tell this story over and over. After her mother's death in 1506, Diane was raised mostly by her father. By the time she was 7, she was already keeping up on horseback with her father, joining his hunting parties with her own pet hawk. As a young woman, Diane was brought to the French court to be educated by Anne of France, a prominent noblewoman who'd once served as regent of France for her brother, Charles VIII. Anne educated Diane in the humanist tradition, so she learned finance, etiquette, law, arts, and architecture. She developed a love of reading and books that would never leave her. Anne also instilled something in her that would be very valuable as she climbed the social ladder: how to always speak intelligently to people about subjects that pleased them. How to get to know someone's interests and cater to them. Essentially, how to survive amidst the turmoil of the French court. The young English maids, Anne and Mary Boleyn, were also staying at court during this time, which I think is a really interesting crossover. At the age of 15, she was already blossoming into a great beauty, with reddish gold hair and bright blue eyes. She had a famously clear and beautiful complexion, and her intellect and sharp wit were already developing. And whether she liked it or not, it was time for Diane to marry. She was soon told that she would marry Louis de Braise, one of her father's friends. Although it was a good marriage, offering wealth, titles, and security, Louis was around 40 years older than his new wife. The married couple settled at the Château d'Anet, 50 miles west of Paris. But anytime she could, Diane would be back at court in the service of the Queen. In January of 1518, Diane gave birth to a daughter whom she named Françoise. She was a very involved mother throughout her life, which was unusual for the time, refusing to turn any of her daughter's care over to the servants. Diane loved children, which shows that she was not only intelligent but also caring. It wasn't long before the couple welcomed a second daughter named Louise. And although she and Louis never came to the romantic love I'm sure she desired, they did form a strong alliance and friendship. He was very protective of his young wife. Diane was notable enough to be called to attend the births and celebration of both of France's princes, Francis, born in 1518, and Henry, born in 1519. Notably, the decorations for Francis's birth were designed by Leonardo da Vinci himself, whom Diane may have met when she was there. She also would have run into another Royalty Now subject, Lorenzo de Medici, who attended Francis's baptism as proxy for the Pope. It seemed that Diane was living a charmed life. She was rich, young, and beautiful, and in close proximity to royalty. However, her husband Louis soon discovered something that would make Diane's world come crashing down. In 1523, a plot against the king, Francis I, had taken shape. It was discovered that Diane's father, Jean, was involved. Jean was soon arrested for treason and sentenced to death, obviously devastating his daughter. What would come next would be a true test of Diane's wit and her ability to survive in the ever-changing French court. She pulled some strings to arrange a meeting with the king and queen. She was no doubt nervous to present her case, But she was raised to be strong, to be diplomatic and persuasive. She could not let her confidence waver now. At the meeting, Diane begged forgiveness for her father. And to her great relief, her request was granted. Her father's sentence was commuted from certain death to just imprisonment, but not until he had been sufficiently scared by being made to wait for an hour with his head on the block. It was heavily rumored that Diane had become King Francis's mistress in exchange for her father's life, although we're not sure if this is true. But in fact, rumors of an affair between Francis and Diane would swirl for nearly his entire reign. King Francis had fought and lost many wars throughout his years as king. Today, he remains more well known for his many lovers than for any of his diplomatic endeavors. His disastrous pursuit to conquer sections of Italy led to his capture at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. He was moved to Spain and held hostage by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, with whom he had a bitter rivalry. To secure his release, the king traded his two young sons, Francis and Henry, into captivity in his place. The boys would remain in prison for 4 years, and their situation became worse and worse as time went on. In retaliation for their ransom not being paid, the boys were moved to damp, dark cells with barred windows. The older prince, Francis, developed smallpox while in captivity and eventually went blind in his left eye. While his sons languished in prison, King Francis lived in the lap of luxury. It's not shocking that when the princes returned to France in 1529, they were considered unpolished, sullen, and mostly silent. Diane was now a trusted member of court, and as a reward for her loyalty, the king and queen requested that she educate their son, Prince Henry, the future King Henry II of France. Over the hours they spent together, the two developed a strong bond. Unfortunately, when Diane was 31, her husband Louis passed away. Although their marriage had not been a love match, it had been mutually supportive, and the loss was felt deeply by her. Unprecedented for the time, Diane was allowed to retain control of her husband's finances, meaning she was a financially independent woman at a time when this was exceedingly rare. Diane was beautiful, independently wealthy, deeply intelligent, and now, crucially, she was free. Would she find another husband, retire from court with her vast riches? No, she had other plans. She had her sights set much higher, to become a woman with royal influence. It was here that Diane decided to cultivate a personal brand for herself. She began to only wear black and white after her husband's death, and adopted the symbol of the goddess Diana, 3 crescent moons intertwined. She was a woman who took remarkably good care of herself, enjoying daily horse riding, bathing, and other beauty rituals. Legend has it that Diane drank an elixir containing liquid gold in an attempt to maintain her youth and beauty. Back at court, an alliance had just been formed. Prince Henry had married Catherine de Medici in 1533. The pair were just 14 years old. To us now, Medici is a powerful and resonant name, but to the people of France back then, Catherine was just a merchant girl from a banking family in Florence, and the marriage was not very popular. However, it did come with a huge dowry and an alliance with Rome. The alliance, over time, did prove to be a very powerful one. And at the time of their marriage, Henry wasn't the heir apparent. It was still his elder brother, Francis. It's believed that just a year or so after his marriage, Diane began to seduce the 15-year-old Henry. From allusions in their correspondence, she was very successful, and the two became lovers that same year. Of course, it makes us feel uncomfortable now. Henry was 15, Diane was 35. Their culture had a different idea of adulthood than we have today, but it's easy to see this as Machiavellian on Diane's end, taking advantage of a young, damaged boy who grew up around her and trusted her. The age gap definitely left Diane in control. She was confident, mature, and intelligent. She had years of experience on Henry and his wife, Catherine, who, of course, was unhappy about Diane's presence. Henry starting an affair with Diane so early in his marriage with Catherine sparked a lifelong rivalry between the two women. When the heir apparent, Francis, died in 1536 at the age of 18, the power in France had shifted once again, and the stakes were raised even higher. Henry, Diane's young lover, would now one day become the king. For the first 3 years of their marriage, Henry and Catherine were childless. Henry even ended up fathering a daughter with another mistress, proving that the, quote, fault did not lay with him, which humiliated Catherine and left her in a very vulnerable position now that her children would one day rule France. Diane knew that if Henry and Catherine were to divorce, her position as his mistress would be threatened. Although famously adversarial, Diane and Catherine formed a sort of alliance to prop up both of their positions at court. Diane even insisted that the two continue their marital relations to make sure that France had an heir to the throne. With the help of Diane, including some possible bedroom advice, Catherine did eventually conceive in 1543, and both of their positions were saved. Upon the death of his father, Francis I, in 1547, Henry assumed the throne as King Henry II of France. Diane's influence was only growing, reaching farther and farther as the years passed. She used her newfound wealth to build new castles and remodel old ones, also becoming sort of an unofficial ambassador, greeting and entertaining dignitaries at her many estates on behalf of the crown. Although she wasn't directly involved in political decisions, King Henry relied on her more and more as his reign continued, even signing their letters jointly and granting Diane some of the crown jewels. This would continue for decades. Diane and Henry would remain as inseparable as they had ever been. The Venetian ambassador, Lorenzo Contarini, remarked that she knows about everything, and every single day after dinner, the king looks for her, spends an hour and a half with her to discuss everything that has happened. She was also granted a permanent place on Henry's council, something that his wife, Catherine de Medici, could only dream of. It seemed to Catherine that if Henry had his way, Diane would be the Queen of France. And honestly, that was probably true. Henry enjoyed the occasional affair with other women and had several mistresses throughout his reign, but Diane remained his lifelong companion. However powerful Diane seemed, her position at court did hinge on Henry's love and loyalty. It at once left her extremely strong and extremely vulnerable. So when in the summer of 1559, Henry was injured during a jousting match, his wife and his mistress were left reeling. He had been blinded by a splintered lance and thrown from his horse. For 10 days, he lay in a state between life and death, with Catherine on one side of his bed and Diane on the other. However, Catherine soon barred Diane from entering the chamber at all, even though Henry repeatedly cried out for her. At the age of 40, King Henry died of an infection caused by his wounds in the year 1559. Despite their rivalry, Catherine did allow Diane to keep most of her property and gifts she had acquired over the years. But she was unofficially exiled. She was expected to stay away from court and retire to her chateau at Anet. She would die there after a fall from a horse a few years later in 1566. Diane was ultimately a woman of contrasts. She was gentle and kind in some ways, like in how much she cared for children and how closely she raised her daughters. But she also had a strong ambition, an uncanny ability to survive, and an almost dragon-like need to accumulate wealth. Whatever perspective you take, ultimately Diane's life was successful by her own standards. In fact, the French kings Louis XV and XVI are direct descendants of her through her two daughters, and so her legacy lives on. So what did Diane de Poitiers really look like? Because her husband from the age of 15 was rich and titled, you would think that we would have at least one formal portrait of Diane. However, we really only have a few sketches. Luckily, the ones we have were made by Jean Clouet, the court painter to King Francis I, who was a very talented artist. His son Francois, who took over as court painter after him, drew and painted many prominent figures like Mary Queen of Scots, and also drew this sketch of Diane later in her life. Jean Clouet made his drawings in black and red chalk, so it does make it a little hard to tell what Diane's hair color is meant to be, whether it's this vivid red, blonde, or a browner hue from some of her more dubiously labeled portraits. Diane was considered a great beauty, maybe not because of her features themselves, but because she made herself very attractive by taking remarkably good care of herself, resulting in her always looking healthy, flushed, and aging much more slowly than those around her. The French historian Brantome once remarked about meeting Diane at the age of 66. He said, "I believe if this lady had lived another 100 years, she would not age." She was, of course, also in possession of alluring personality traits like her intelligence and wit. There are many allegorical paintings associated with her, like this one which depicts her as the goddess Diana. But it's not believed that Diane posed for any of these in life, making it difficult to discern her true appearance. However, Diane loved these paintings because of how closely she associated herself with the goddess. I'm going to use this sketch from 1525 for my recreation. Diane would be about 25 years old here, and we know that she posed for it from life. So let's take a look at the face of Diane de Poitiers now.